Hello, everyone. Well, today we're going to be continuing to read Hinds' Feet on High Places, where the beloved story of Much Afraid and her exciting journey to the high places, by Hannah Hernard. All right, Charlotte.
The Great Precipice Injury. All right, hold on just a second. I've got to finish. Okay. All right, the Great Precipice Injury. After that, for a little while, Much Afraid had a song in her heart as she walked among the fields and orchards and the low hills of the country to which they had come. It hardly seemed to matter now that sorrow and suffering were still with her because of the hope leaping in her heart that soon they would cease to be her companions altogether. For when she came to the mountains again, and they had helped her up to the high places, she would need them no longer. Neither did it matter that the path they followed still led southward, twisting along the hills and leading through the quiet valleys, because she had the shepherd's own promise that soon it would lead her back to the eastern mountains and to the place of her heart's desire. After a time, the path began sloping upward toward the summits of the hills. One day they suddenly reached the top of the highest of the hills, and just as the sun rose, found themselves on a great plateau. They looked eastward toward the golden sunrise, and Much Afraid burst into a cry of joy and thankfulness. There, at no great distance, on the further side of the plateau, were the mountains, quite distant and rising like a great wall, crowded with the ramparts of towers and pinnacles, all of which were glowing rose red and gold in the sunrise. Never, thought she, had she seen anything so beautiful. As the sun rose higher and the glow faded from the sky, she saw that the highest peaks were covered with snow, so white and glittering that her eyes were dazzled with their glory. She was looking at the high places themselves. Best of all, the path they were following here turned eastward and led directly toward the mountains. Much Afraid fell on her knees on the hilltop, bowed her head, and worshipped. It seemed to her at the moment that all the pain and the postponements and all the sorrows and trials of the long journey she had made were as nothing compared to the glory which shone before her. It seemed to her, too, that even her companions were smiling with her. When she had worshipped and rejoiced, she rose to her feet, and all three started to cross the plateau. It was amazing how quickly they went, for the path was flat and comparatively smooth, and before they could have believed it possible, they found themselves approaching the mountains and were among the slopes and boulders at their feet. As they approached, Much Afraid could not help being struck by the steepness of these slopes, and the nearer they drew, the more like impassable walls the mountains appeared to become. But she told herself that when she was right up to them, that they would find a valley or gorge or a pass up which they could proceed. and that she certainly would not mind how steep the way was, if only it led upward. In the late afternoon they did come to the top of the lower slopes and to the very foot of the mountains. The path they were following led them right up to the foot of an impassable precipice, and there stopped, dead. Much Afraid stood still and stared. The more she looked, the more stunned she felt. Then she began to tremble and shake all over, for the whole mountain range before her, as far as she could see to the left and to the right, rose up in unbroken walls of rock so high that it made her giddy. When she put her head back and tried to look up to the top, the cliffs completely blocked the way before her, yet the path ran right up to them, then stopped. There was no sign of a track in any direction, and there was no way at all by which the overhanging, terrifying wall of cliff could be ascended. They would have to turn back. Just as this overwhelming realization came to her, suffering caught her hand and pointed to the rocky walls. A heart followed by a hind had appeared from among the jumbled rocks around them and were now actually beginning to ascend the precipice. As the three stood watching, Much Afraid turned dizzy and faint, for she saw that the hart, which was leading the way, was following what appeared to be a narrow and intensely steep track which went zigzagging across the face of the cliff. In some parts it was only a narrow ledge, in others there appeared to be rough steps, but in certain places she saw that the rock apparently broke right off. Then the hart would leap across the gap and go springing upward, always followed by the hind, who set her feet exactly where his had been, and leaped after him as lightly and as sure-footed and apparently unafraid as it was possible for any creature to be. So the two of them leaped and sprang with perfect grace and assurance up the face of the precipice and disappeared from sight over the top. Much Afraid covered her face with her hands and sank down on a rock with a horror and dread in her heart such as she had never felt before. Then she felt her two companions take her hands in theirs and heard them say, "Do not be afraid, Much Afraid. This is not a dead end after all, and we shall not have to turn back. There is a way up the face of the precipice. The hart and the hind have shown it to us quite plainly. We shall be able to follow it too and make the ascent." Yes. Oh, no, no, Much Afraid almost shrieked. "The path is utterly impossible. The deer may be able to manage it, but no human being could. I could never get up there. I would fall headlong and be broken into pieces on those awful rocks." She burst into hysterical sobbing. "It's an impossibility, an absolute impossibility. I cannot get to the high places that way, and so can never get there at all." Her two guides tried to say something more, but she put her hands over her ears and broke into another clamor of terrified sobs. There was the shepherd's Much Afraid sitting at the foot of the precipice, wringing her hands and shaking with terror and sobbing all over and over again. I can't do it. I shall never get to the high places. Nothing less like royalty could be imagined, but far worse was to follow. As she crouched on the ground, completely exhausted, they heard a crunching sound and a rattling of loose stones, then a voice close beside her. Ha ha! My dear little cousin, we meet again at last. How do you find yourself now, much afraid, in this delightfully pleasant situation? She opened her eyes in fresh terror and found herself looking right into the hideous face of Craven Fear himself. I thought somehow, he went on with a look of the most horrible gloating. Yes, I really thought that we could come together again at last. Do you really believe, you poor little fool, that you could escape from me altogether? No, 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 much afraid. You are one of the fearlings, and you can't evade the truth. And what is more, you trembling little idiot, you belong to me. I have come to take you back safely and make sure that you don't wander off again. I won't go with you, gasped Much Afraid, too shocked by this awful apparition to have her wits about her. I absolutely refuse to go with you. Well, you can take your choice, sneered Craven. Take a look at that precipice before you, my dear cousin. Won't you feel lovely up there? Just look where I'm pointing, Much Afraid. See there halfway up where that dizzy little ledge breaks right off, and you have to jump across the chasm onto that bit of rock. Just picture yourself jumping that, Much Afraid. Yes. And finding yourself hanging over space, clutching a bit of slippery rock which you can't hold on to. Another minute. Just imagine those ugly knife-like rocks at the foot of the precipice waiting to receive and mangle you to pieces as your strength gives out and you plunge down, all the way down on them. Doesn't it give you a lovely feeling, Much Afraid? Just take time to picture that. That's only one of the many broken places on the track. And the higher you go, you dear little fool, the farther you will have to fall. Well, take your choice. Either you must go up there where you know that you can't, but we'll end up in a mangled heap at the bottom. Or you must come back and live with me and be my little slave ever afterward. And the rocks and the cliffs seemed to echo again with his gloating laughter. Much Afraid, said the two guides, stooping over her and shaking her by the shoulder gently but firmly. Much Afraid, you know where your help lies. Call for help. She clung to them and sobbed again. I am afraid to call, she gasped. I am so afraid that if I call him, he will tell me that I must go that way, that dreadful, dreadful way, and I can't. It's impossible. I can't face it. Oh, what shall I do? Whatever shall I do? Sorrow bent over her and said very gently but urgently, you must call for him. Much Afraid, call at once. If I call him, shuddered Much Afraid, through chattering teeth, he will tell me to build an altar, and I can't. This time I can't. Craven Fear laughed triumphantly and took a step toward her. But her two companions put themselves between him and his victim. Then Suffering looked at Sorrow, who nodded back in answer to the nod. Suffering took a small but very sharp knife which hung at her girdle, and bending over the crouching figure, pricked her. Much Afraid cried out in anguish, and then, in utter despair at finding herself hopeless in the presence of all three, did that which she ought to have done the moment the path brought them to the foot of the precipice, though now she felt too ashamed to do it. She did so because she was forced by her extreme. She cried out, "Oh Lord, I'm oppressed. Undertake for me. My fears have taken hold upon me, and I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed to look up." Why, Much Afraid, it was the shepherd's voice close beside her. "What is the matter? Be of good cheer. It is I. Be not afraid." He sounded so cheery and full of strength, and moreover without a hint of reproach, that Much Afraid felt as though a strong and exhilarating cordial had been poured into her heart, and that a stream of courage and strength was flowing into her from his presence.
She sat up and looked at him and saw that he was smiling, almost laughing at her. The shame in her eyes met no answering reproach in his. And suddenly she found words echoing in her heart, which other trembling souls had spoken. My Lord is of very tender compassion to them that are afraid. As she looked, thankfulness welled up in her heart, and the icy hand of fear which had clutched her broke and melted away, and joy burst into bloom. A little song ran through her mind like a trickling stream. My beloved is the chiefest of 10,000s anywhere. He is altogether lovely. He is altogether fair. My beloved is so gentle and is so strong beyond compare. Much Afraid, said the shepherd again. Tell me, what is the matter? Why were you so fearful? It is the way you have chosen for me to go, she whispered. It looks so dreadful, shepherd, so impossible. I turn giddy and faint whenever I look at it. The Rose and Hinds can go there, but they are not limping, crippled, or cowardly like me. But Much Afraid, what did I promise you in the Valley of Humiliation? Asked the shepherd with a smile. Much Afraid looked startled, and the blood rushed into her cheeks and ebbed again, leaving them as white as before. You said, she began and broke off, and then began again. Oh, shepherd, you said you would make my feet like hinds' feet and set me upon mine high places. Well, he answered cheerfully, the only way to develop hinds' feet is to go by the paths which the hinds' feet use, like this one. Much Afraid trembled and looked at him shamefacedly. I don't think I want hinds' feet. If it meant I have to go on a path like that, she said slowly and painfully. The shepherd was a very surprising person. Instead of looking either disappointed or disapproving, he actually laughed again. Oh, yes, you do, he said cheerfully. I know you better than you know yourself, Much Afraid. You want it very much indeed, and I promise you these hinds' feet, indeed. I have brought you on purpose to this backside of the desert, where the mountains and particularly steep, where there are no paths but the tracks of the deer and of the mountain goats for you to follow, that the promise may be fulfilled. What did I say to you the last time that we met? You said, now shalt thou see what I will do, she answered, and then looking at him reproachfully added, but I never dreamed you would do anything like this. Lead me to an impassable precipice, up which nothing can do or go but the deer and goats. When I'm no longer like a deer or a goat, then is a jellyfish. It's too, she fumbled for words and then burst out laughing. Why, it's too preposterously absurd. It's crazy. Whatever will you do next? The shepherd laughed too. I love doing preposterous things, he replied. Why, I don't know anything more exhilarating and delightful than turning weakness into strength and fear into faith, and that which has been marred into perfection. If there is one thing more than another which I should enjoy doing at this moment, is turning a jellyfish into a mountain goat. That is my special work, he added, with a light of a great joy in his face. Transforming things, to take Much Afraid, for instance, and to transform her into, he broke off and then went on laughingly, well, we shall see later on what she finds herself transformed into. It was really extraordinary scene in the place where just a little while before all had been fear and despair, where the shepherd and Much Afraid, sitting on the rocks at the foot of the impassable precipice, laughing together as though it was the greatest joke in the world. Come now, little jellyfish, said the shepherd. Do you believe that I can change you into a mountain goat and get you to the top of the precipice? Yes, replied Much Afraid. Will you let me do it? Yes, she answered. If you want to do such a crazy and preposterous thing, why certainly you may. Do you believe that I will let you be put to shame on the way up? Much Afraid looked at him and then said something that she had never been willing to say before. I don't think I mind so very much if you do. Only have you your will and way in me, shepherd. Nothing else matters. As she spoke, something lovely happened. A double rainbow appeared above the precipice, arching it completely, so that the zigzag path up which the roe and the doe had gone was framed in the glowing colors. It was such a beautiful and extraordinary sight that Much Afraid gasped with wonder and delight. But there was something else about it, which was almost more wonderful. She saw that Sorrow and Suffering, who had drawn aside while the shepherd spoke to her, were standing one at either side of the path. And where the ends of the rainbow touched the earth, one touched Suffering and the other Sorrow. In the shining glory of the rainbow colors, the two veiled figures were so transfigured with beauty that Much Afraid could only look at them for a moment before being dazzled. Then she did, which only a short time before had seemed utterly impossible. She knelt down at the foot of the precipice and built in an altar and laid on it her will, her dread, and her shrinking. And when the fire had fallen, she found among the ashes a larger and rougher looking stone than any of the others, sharp-edged and dark in color, but otherwise quite ordinary looking. This she put in her purse, and then rose to her feet and waited for the shepherd to show her what to do. In her heart, she was hoping that he would accompany her up this dreadful ascent, as he had gone with her down into the desert, but this he did not do. Instead, he led her to the foot of the precipice and said, Now, Much Afraid, you have really come at last to the foot of the high places, and a new stage of the journey is to begin. There are new lessons for you to learn. I must tell you that this precipice, to which the path has led you, is at the foot of Mount Injury. The whole mountain range stretches a long way beyond this in either direction, and everywhere it is as steep or even steeper than here. There are even more terrible precipices on the sides of the mount, revealing the Mount Hate and Mount Persecution and others besides. But nowhere is it impossible to find a way up to the high places and into the kingdom of love without surrounding at least one of them. This is the one which I have chosen for you to ascend. On the way here, you have been learning the lesson of acceptance with joy, which is the first letter in the alphabet of love. Now you must learn the V of the alphabet of love. You have come to the foot of Mount Injury, and I hope and expect that on the way up the precipice you will discover what is this next letter of the alphabet, and that you will learn and practice it as you have A of love. Remember that though you must now meet injury and surmount it, there is nothing on the way up this terrible looking precipice, nor indeed anything that you may meet above and beyond it that you can do, it that can do you the slightest harm or hurt if you will learn and steadfastly practice the second lesson in the ascent of love. When he had said this, he put his hand upon her with special solemnity and gentleness and blessed her. Then he called her companions, who immediately stepped forward. Next, he took a rope from a crevice in the wall of the rock, and with his own hands roped together the three who were to ascend the precipice. Sorrow was in front and Suffering behind, with Much Afraid in the middle, so that the two who were so strong and sure-footed went before and after. In this way, even if Much Afraid slipped and fell, they would be able to hold her up and support her by the rope. Lastly, he put his hand to his side and brought out a little bottle of cordial, which he gave to Much Afraid, telling her to drink a little at once and make use of it every time she felt giddy or faint on the way up. The label on the bottle read, Spirit of Grace and Comfort. And when Much Afraid had taken a drop or two, she felt so revived and strengthened that she was ready to begin the ascent without any feeling of faintness, although there was still a sensation of dread in her heart. By this time, the evening was well advanced, but being summer, there were yet 2 or 3 hours before it would begin to be dark. And the shepherd charged them to start at once, for, said he, although you cannot possibly reach the top before nightfall, there is a cave further and farther up the cliff, which you cannot see from here, and there you can rest and spend the night in perfect safety. If you stay down here at the foot of the precipice, your enemies will most certainly steal upon you and seek to do you harm. However, they will not follow you up this track, and while you are going up, you will be beyond their reach. Though I doubt not, he added warningly, that you will meet them again when you have reached the top. With that, he smiled encouragingly upon them, and immediately Sorrow put her foot upon the first step of the narrow little track which zigzagged up from the face of the cliff. Much Afraid followed next, and then Suffering, and in a moment or two they were beginning the ascent.
Hey,
Yes, tomorrow we'll continue on chapter 10.
all right. That answered my question. I was going to ask, did you want to go ahead and do the ascent? But if you want to go ahead
Yeah,
and,
I'll wait till tomorrow.
all right. All right.